On a rainy night, cloaked in secrets, a betrayed nobleman disguises himself as a humble coachman, quietly driving his wife and her lover toward a scandalous rendezvous. With each mile traveled, each whispered confession overheard, he is pulled deeper into a storm of longing, regret, and truth. But the night holds unexpected revelations about her heart, his own soul, and the fragile bond they believed long lost. Amidst shadows and silence, can love be reborn from betrayal itself? Twilight draped the outskirts of the D'Artois estate in a veil of silver mist, the last of the sun smothered by a low, weeping sky. A faint drizzle traced the air, threading between bare branches and tapping over the cobblestones like cautious fingertips. The scent of damp soil mingled with the dying perfume of autumn roses, their petals bruised and clinging to the hedgerows with quiet defiance. In the courtyard below the west wing, the carriage stood ready, its lacquered sides slick with moisture, its wheels gleaming darkly beneath the oil lanterns swinging overhead. Count Adrien d'Artois adjusted the leather gloves on his hands, pulling each strap tight with slow, deliberate movements. The coat he wore was thick wool, charcoal gray, the kind issued to hired men whose names were never learned and whose faces were meant to be forgotten. Beneath the brim of a plain tricorn hat, his features were half obscured by shadow and the softness of rain. He moved with precision, almost mechanical in his stillness, but inside him something burned, something hot and furious and almost unrecognizable. His thoughts looped, restrained but not soothed, the way a tightly wound spring hums beneath the surface before snapping. It had been less than 3 hours since he overheard them. A quiet conversation in the parlor, just beyond the threshold of the library door. He hadn't meant to listen at first. But when he'd heard his wife's voice, soft but clear, and the name of Lucien Moreau spoken with such ease, he'd gone utterly still. The words that followed had cut with polite finality. Eloise would be attending the masquerade at Hôtel d'Amélie. She would travel tonight. A private carriage had been arranged. She and Lucien would leave after dusk. And Adrien, her husband, had not been mentioned once. Now, as he fastened the carriage lantern and wiped the reins with a cloth, Adrien tried to force his mind into silence. He had not chosen confrontation. Not yet. There would be no raised voice, no public disgrace. The weight of his family's name, the blood of kings 2 generations removed, it all demanded discretion. And so, he'd taken another path. He'd dismissed the usual coachman with a forged message. He'd dressed in the livery himself. And now he would drive her, his wife, into the arms of another man. His pulse ticked in his throat as he stepped back from the carriage and cast one last glance at the estate behind him. Montvignon rose like a silhouette against the fog, its limestone facade glowing faintly in the lantern light. So much of his life, his childhood, his inheritance, his marriage, was etched into that structure. Now it loomed like a mausoleum of forgotten oaths. A soft clatter of footsteps broke through the hush. Adrien turned toward the manor steps, jaw tightening. She was coming. Eloise emerged from beneath the archway, her figure outlined in the glow of the front lantern. She wore a velvet cloak the color of night, its hood drawn over her golden hair, the folds rippling as she walked. Her posture, as always, was perfect, head high, back straight, her hands hidden in the deep sleeves. Her gown swept behind her in disciplined silence. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman raised among marble halls and mirrors, taught to command attention with every breath. Beside her, Lucien Moreau followed with a smile curling on his lips, an expression too familiar, too confident. He carried himself with that particular ease of the rising bourgeoisie, unburdened by titles, but full of ambition and elegance bought with new money. He wore a tailored coat of burgundy wool, a light cravat knotted in a casual loop, and boots polished to a high sheen. His hair was uncovered, unpowdered, brushing the collar of his coat with deliberate informality. They approached the carriage together, talking in tones too low to decipher. Neither of them spared more than a passing glance at the coachman standing beside the open door. Adrien inclined his head, as any servant might, and held the handle steady as Lucienne assisted Eloise inside. She did not meet Adrien's eyes. She hadn't even noticed him. That, perhaps, wounded more than her betrayal. Adrien closed the carriage door with a quiet finality and stepped back to the driver's box. He mounted it in a single practiced motion, the reins folding into his gloved hands. The horses shifted beneath him, steam curling from their flanks into the cold air. His fingers curled around the leather straps, white-knuckled. The air inside the carriage was sealed behind him now, sealed with laughter, warmth, and the scent of her perfume. The wheels groaned into motion, crunching over gravel slick with rain. The iron lanterns on either side of the carriage flickered against the shadows, casting gold light onto the winding path ahead. Adrien urged the horses forward down the avenue lined with chestnut trees, their leaves fallen and scattered like the remnants of a season that had passed too quickly. The canopy above was bare and skeletal, branches clattering faintly in the wind. From behind him, laughter rose, a light, lilting sound that didn't belong to her anymore. Not like this. It was the sound of intimacy blooming in stolen spaces. Her voice reached him in a hush that felt cruel in its familiarity. Her words muffled but unmistakably easy, unguarded. It wasn't just the laughter that cut. It was that she had never laughed that way with him. Or perhaps not in years. His breath fogged in the air as he stared straight ahead, not blinking. He forced his shoulders into stillness, hands steady on the reins, even as heat spread up his spine, beneath the collar of the coat. The rain grew softer now, a fine mist again, washing the scent of wet leaves and horse sweat into the air. The estate behind them faded, swallowed by distance and fog. Ahead, only the forest waited. Adrien knew every inch of this road. He'd ridden it alone at dawn, galloped it at midnight. Tonight, it felt foreign. The road stretched on through fields, then dipped into woodland that clung to the hills like a sleeping beast. The trees thickened, damp with rain, their trunks darkened to near black, and the moss below steaming faintly as the temperature dropped. Inside the carriage, the laughter waned. Silence bloomed for a moment, then the quiet rhythm of conversation resumed. Her voice, his voice, close. Too close. Adrien's grip on the reins flexed. He did not allow himself to imagine what was happening inside. He only listened. He had always been good at listening, especially when no one thought he was there. As the road sloped downward into the first bend of the forest path, the wheels dipped into uneven ground. Adrien adjusted the horses' pace, keeping them slow. The fog thickened between the trees, curling low, and the trees crowded nearer, the way they always did this time of year. The lantern light barely reached the brush. And then, a snap. Sharp and sudden, like a branch breaking, or a footfall miscalculated. The horses reared slightly, their hooves scraping against the mud, the reins pulling taut in Adrien's hands. He held fast, murmuring low through clenched teeth. The carriage tilted, groaned, then steadied. For a moment, all was still again, the only sound the huffing of the horses and the whisper of leaves overhead. Adrien turned his head, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. But the sound had not been an animal. He knew the difference. This had been intentional, a presence, a mistake, or perhaps a warning. He narrowed his eyes, breath shallow, the reins trembling slightly between his fingers. Something, or someone, was out there. The forest swallowed the road with quiet authority, its bare limbs stretching across the sky like ink strokes on parchment. As the carriage pushed forward, the moonlight emerged in trembling flashes, slipping through the jagged canopy overhead. The mist had thickened, curling low across the earth, and the air smelled of wet bark and sodden leaves. Adrien d'Artois kept the reins taut in his grip, his shoulders squared, his eyes constantly flicking between the path and the woods to either side. The sharp sound from earlier, the snap that had cracked through the silence, had faded. But the echo of it remained, threaded through every gust of wind and creaking bough. It had not been danger, not in the sense of highwaymen or wolves. Adrian would have known. This was something subtler, more corrosive, a presence, a reminder. And yet, it was not the forest that set his pulse to a low, slow thunder. It was the voices drifting from the carriage behind him. He heard her laugh again, lower this time, threaded with contemplation rather than amusement. Lucien's voice followed, smooth and measured. Adrian could not decipher their full exchange, the sound muffled by wood, velvet, and the distance of custom. But single words rose to the surface now and then like dead leaves on still water. Paris, masks, freedom, desire. Adrian's jaw tensed. The reins dug into his palms. These were not words a wife ought to speak to a man, not her husband, not under the shelter of secrecy and moonlight. But what he heard was not seduction. There was no practiced flirtation, no coquette's laugh, no honeyed lies. There was something rawer. Eloise sounded like a woman unraveling, a woman asking to be seen. The road grew narrower, the trees pressing in as if listening. A distant owl hooted once, then fell silent. The wheels crunched over wet branches and slick gravel. Adrian breathed in slowly, the cold air catching in his chest. The weight of her voice, even broken into fragments, found its way into the hollows of him. He had not realized how long it had been since he had truly heard her speak. Inside the carriage, Eloise sat with her hands folded in her lap, her fingers twined too tightly. Her cloak had loosened from her shoulders, revealing the intricate embroidery of her dark gown beneath. The air was close and scented with damp velvet and rosewater, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the opposite wall, unfocused, her words falling softly into the space between herself and Lucienne. She spoke of the manor, of long days spent seated beneath painted ceilings, watching the light fade from stained glass windows, of dinners held in echoing silence, of words that fell flat between polished silver and crystal. She spoke of Adrian, not with cruelty, but with distance. A man she once loved, who had become a shadow walking beside her, always present, always proper, but never close. Lucien listened without interruption at first, nodding gently, his face cast in flickering lantern light. His admiration was evident, but he wore it like a youthful robe, a thing not yet broken in, too new to carry real weight. When Eloise fell silent, he leaned forward slightly, as if to pull her back into conversation, but she raised a hand faintly to stop him. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted aloud, to the window, to herself. The words came quietly. "I only know I need to feel something different. Anything." Lucien hesitated. The warmth in his eyes dulled slightly, tempered by a realization that perhaps she was not seeking a man, but a way out. He reached for her hand, and she let him hold it, though her fingers remained still, her mind elsewhere. On the driver's box, Adrian exhaled slowly. He had heard only pieces, but it was enough to know that she was not simply running from him. She was trying to remember who she had been before marriage, before titles, before duty crushed her voice into quiet obedience. And he had not noticed. Or worse, he had noticed and done nothing. The wheels groaned beneath him, and the right side dipped sharply. The carriage jolted without warning, a sudden lurch that nearly pitched Adrian forward. The horses whinnied and stamped, their hooves slipping against the muddy ground. He pulled them steady, cursing under his breath, and brought the carriage to a halt beside the narrow path. The damage was immediate. He could feel the imbalance in the wheel even before he stepped down. The rim had split along one side. The iron band peeled back and warped from a rut hidden beneath fallen leaves. It would not carry them far like this, not safely. The nearest posting inn would be another hour, maybe more. Repairs had to be made. Adrian led the horses off the path, guiding them beneath the dripping canopy of twisted ash trees. Moss clung to their roots like a second skin. Rain tapped faintly on his shoulders as he moved to the side of the carriage, inspecting the brake. His gloves were soon slick with mud and rust as he examined the wheel's structure, judging how best to brace it. The lantern on the carriage door swayed in the breeze, casting its flickering light across the road and into the woods beyond. Adrian's breath clouded as he reached up and opened the door, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He gestured in silence, keeping his voice masked beneath the persona he had assumed. Inside, Eloise turned toward the movement. Her brow furrowed slightly as she leaned forward. The light caught the edge of the coachman's coat, the worn curve of his shoulder, the line of his jaw. Something in the way he stood, too straight, too still, pulled at her memory. Not consciously. Not yet. But some part of her stirred in recognition. Lucien stepped out first, grumbling under his breath about delays. Eloise followed more slowly. She paused at the threshold, one gloved hand resting on the frame of the door. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the driver, at the man who had said nothing, who had not once raised his voice or sought their favor. The man who had remained steady even as the road broke beneath them. She stepped down carefully, the hem of her gown brushing against the wet ground. Her shoes sank slightly into the mud, and she drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders. Still, her gaze returned to the driver's face. She could see little of it, only the line of his mouth, the shadowed jaw, the damp edge of hair curling near the collar. But there was something, a stillness too familiar, a tension she had seen before, felt before, in another room, another season. He turned from her then, moving to retrieve the tools from the rear compartment, and she stood there, unmoving, her eyes still fixed to the place where he had been. The air between them was damp, hushed. The forest closed in around them, pressing tighter, the mist rising now from the undergrowth in steady breath. And somewhere, deeper in the woods, a sound stirred again, just faint enough to question if it had ever been real. Rain began to fall in earnest as the three stepped down onto the sodden roadside, the first drops gathering in heavy beads on velvet and wool before darkening into wet stains. The ground beneath them was soft and treacherous, sucking at the heels of their boots and shoes with every shift of weight. The trees loomed taller now, closer, their bare limbs dripping with water and trembling in the rising wind. A hush hung over the forest, not peace, but something too still, too breathless. The mist had thickened, curling and coiling between trunks like smoke from a dying fire. Adrian, wordless still, gestured toward the damaged wheel with a respectful dip of his head. He did not look directly at them. His gloved hand pointed out the warped rim, then fell back to his side. Without waiting for acknowledgement, he moved to the back of the carriage and began unfastening the storage trunk. The lock clicked open beneath his fingers, and the hinges creaked faintly under the weight of rain. Tools lay within, kept in pristine order, as they always were. Adrian pulled out a metal brace and a wedge, his movements swift, efficient, silent. Lucien exhaled sharply beside the carriage, the sound full of irritation. His boot tapped once against a loose stone before sinking again into mud. "We'll be late," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced toward the darkened road ahead, as though he could will Paris closer through sheer force of annoyance. His gloved fingers brushed the edge of his waistcoat, his other hand pushing damp hair away from his forehead. He did not help. He did not offer. Adrian noted it without judgment, but also without surprise. Eloise stood apart from both men, her cloak pulled tightly around her shoulders. Raindrops clung to her lashes, and her breath showed pale in the chill. Her eyes, green and dark in the dim light, moved slowly across the surrounding woods. The silence pressed in on her, thick, insistent. The wind rattled a few distant branches, but otherwise the forest remained oppressively still. "It's too quiet," she said softly, more to the trees than to either man. Her voice held none of its earlier lightness. "Even the birds have stopped." She paused, then added in a quieter tone, "The mist. It looks like smoke." "Doesn't it?" Neither man responded immediately. Adrian knelt at the wheel now, inspecting the split in the iron rim. His knees sank into the wet earth, mud soaking quickly through his breeches. He could feel the chill in his joints, the ache that came not from weather, but from restraint. The wheel had twisted clean along the rim's edge, just beneath the join. Temporary repair was possible, but only just. His hands worked with precise rhythm, each movement practiced from years of self-reliance, of choosing to do things himself when others faltered. Behind him, Lucien turned toward Eloise again. His smile returned, an echo of its former brightness. "You're shivering," he said gently, moving to brush a damp curl from her temple. "It's only a storm. The forest always seems more mysterious than it is." She blinked, her gaze still caught on the woods. "I don't think it's the forest," she murmured. "It's something else." She turned toward the carriage. Her eyes landed on the coachman's back, broad beneath the wet coat, shoulders drawn taut beneath the effort of silence. There was something unnerving about him. Not threatening, not unfamiliar in a dangerous way, but something in the way he moved, the way he listened without reacting. She stared longer than she meant to. "What's his name?" she asked abruptly. Lucien raised an eyebrow. "The coachman?" He shrugged. "No idea. I assumed he was from Montvignon's staff." Adrien straightened slightly, not turning around. He lifted his voice only enough to carry over the rain. "Mathieu, milady," he said, his voice low and roughened, altered just enough to disguise. Eloise tilted her head. The name struck no memory, but the tone of it did. Graveled, measured, not a laborer's. Her frown deepened. "You don't sound like a man who drives carriages for a living," she said, mostly to herself. Adrien didn't reply. He reached again for the brace, slotting it into the wheel's frame and driving it into place with a firm, decisive strike. The metallic sound echoed dully in the clearing. He adjusted the tension of the wheel's axle and ran a final check along the rim. The work would hold, long enough to reach the nearest inn if they went slow and steady. He rose, brushing mud from his knees, and motioned toward the carriage with a small, controlled gesture. The wind pulled at his coat as he moved to open the door once more. Lucien stepped forward, offering Eloise his hand with practiced grace. Their fingers met, and she let him assist her, her palm lingering in his a moment longer than necessary. Adrien watched from the corner of his eye, face unreadable beneath the dripping brim of his hat. His chest felt hollow, but not with surprise. He had prepared himself for this. And still, the sight of her hand in another man's stung like salt to an old wound. But Eloise hesitated again before stepping into the carriage. Her gaze returned to the coachman, sharp and uncertain. She couldn't name the feeling. Not suspicion, not quite recognition, but it unsettled her. The set of his shoulders, the silent control of his hands, even the way he looked at nothing and everything all at once. It reminded her of Adrien. Not the man he had become, quiet and formal behind closed doors, but the man she had known when they were first married, when his gaze alone could make her breath catch. That memory stirred something heavy in her chest, and guilt, unfamiliar and slow, followed behind it. She looked away and stepped inside. Adrien closed the door behind her, the latch clicking softly into place. He mounted the driver's box again, settling himself with a breath that did not steady him. Rain now sheeted across the road, the sound of it drumming on the carriage roof like fingers tapping at the truth. The forest was darker now, and the mist more persistent, thickening in the hollows. The horses, anxious but obedient, responded to his touch. The carriage rolled forward once more, the damaged wheel groaning faintly as it moved over the slick ground. Adrien kept the pace slow, his focus narrowed to the path ahead. Behind him, the silence inside the carriage was different now. No more laughter, no whispered flirtations, only the quiet of shared tension, of words once spoken now left to settle like dust. The rain fell harder, and the wind picked up. Adrien leaned slightly forward into it, eyes narrowed. Every tree now looked like a shadow leaning too far. Every twist in the road felt more precarious than the last, He was drenched to the skin, but he didn't notice the cold. His hands moved on instinct, his thoughts far from his own comfort. Up ahead, the forest began to thin. A bend curved away from the ravine's edge and opened into a low clearing. And there, through the veil of fog and rain, he saw it, a single lantern swaying in the distance, its light flickering amber through the mist. A solitary inn. Relief stirred low in his chest. Shelter, warmth, somewhere to rest, if only for a few hours. He urged the horses forward, careful not to push them too fast. The road curved again, narrowing sharply as it descended. The ground was slicker here, a mix of gravel and wet clay. The trees loomed taller near the bend, and then, without warning, the horses shrieked. Something darted across the road, low, fast, and utterly silent. Adrian didn't see its form, only the blur of movement, the shift in air, the flicker of something not quite natural. The horses reared violently, hooves scraping and slipping. The carriage rocked, tipped. Adrian fought the reins, yelling out, but the wheels caught in a shallow trench along the road's edge, and the entire vehicle lurched hard to the side. The world tilted, wood groaned, metal screeched, and the carriage began to slide. The carriage shuddered violently as the wheels dug into the slick edge of the roadside, the momentum dragging the heavy frame toward the ditch with a groan of wood and iron. Adrian yanked the reins hard, his teeth clenched, breath tight in his chest. For a terrifying second, the entire vehicle tilted, balance faltering, then slammed down again with a spine-jarring jolt. Mud splashed high onto the undercarriage. The horses reared, then steadied, snorting heavily, their flanks gleaming wet in the lantern light. The storm had not let up. It poured in thick sheets now, beating against the road, swallowing sound and vision alike. The wheels had sunk deep into the soft shoulder, only feet from the ditch's drop. Adrian jumped from the driver's box, boots landing heavily in the muck. His hands were locked around the reins, fingers stiff and cramping from the strain. He released them slowly, every movement precise, forcing his body to obey his will. His heart thundered beneath his coat, not just from the near accident, but from the memory of the blurred figure that had darted across the path. Whatever had crossed the road was gone, not a creature he could name. No animal he recognized moved like that, too fast, too silent. It had disappeared into the mist as though it had never been. But the road ahead was no longer safe. The incline was too steep, the rain too heavy. He turned his head toward the faint lantern still burning up ahead, swaying in the wind like a beacon barely clinging to its post. A modest coaching inn came into view, small, unassuming, but solid against the wildness around it. Its iron sign creaked softly in the wind, swinging on rusted chains above a heavy oak door. The windows glowed with golden light, blurred by the rain, casting soft halos onto the stone path. Adrian moved to the horses, speaking to them in low tones, his hand on one's flank, calming, grounding. He clicked his tongue gently and began guiding them forward, wheels dragging reluctantly from the muddy dip. Inside the carriage, Eloise sat rigid, her hand clutching the velvet seat so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The jolt had knocked her slightly to the side, her shoulder pressed against the panel. She hadn't cried out, but the breath had caught in her throat and hadn't released since. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, her pulse fluttering too fast beneath her corset. She could still feel the lean of the carriage, the gravity pulling her toward the edge, toward something unknown. Lucien shifted beside her and looked out the window, trying to gauge where they were. "We should go inside," he said, voice firm but tinged with relief. "The road's no good in this weather. We'll rest a few hours, leave at first light. We'll still reach the ball by morning." Eloise didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the window opposite her, watching as the blurred shape of the inn came into view. Its glow was surreal, welcoming and out of place amid the cold, wet wildness around them. For a moment she didn't move, then she nodded once and waited for the coachman to come. Adrian reached the door, breath visible in the cold, and opened it. Light spilled from the carriage's interior onto the churned mud below. He stood aside, face shadowed beneath his hat, offering no hand, no word. Eloise stepped down slowly. Her satin shoes sank into the soft earth, water soaking the hem of her gown, but she hardly noticed. The wind caught at her cloak, tugging it aside, and she pulled it closer around her. Lucien followed her out, casting a glance toward the woods before gesturing her forward toward the inn. He extended his hand once more. This time, Eloise didn't take it. They walked the short distance to the door, their silhouettes shifting in and out of the flickering light. The door opened under Lucien's hand, and they stepped into warmth. The scent hit first, roasted chestnuts and damp wood smoke, mingled with the faint trace of brandy. The inn's interior was narrow but inviting, lined in dark wood and dimly lit by wall sconces and the roaring fire in the hearth. The glow painted the stone floor in amber, and a single figure stood behind the counter, a man of indeterminate age, wiping a glass with slow indifference. He looked up as they entered, eyes dull with disinterest, and gave a brief nod of welcome. Lucien approached first, his manner easy. He made polite inquiries, asked for accommodations. The innkeeper barely glanced at them, muttering that the weather had delayed several travelers and that only one room remained. Lucien smirked at the news, half laughing, half amused. A shared room, how convenient. Eloise said nothing. She glanced once at the fire, then at the stairs leading to the upper level. Her eyes passed the window beside the hearth, where the reflection of the flame distorted the night beyond. Just beyond the glass, she could make out the dark shape of the carriage still in the yard, and the faint outline of the coachman walking the horses toward the stable. She felt it again. That odd pressure between her shoulder blades, the sense of being watched, not the way strangers watched women of status, but something more familiar, more precise. She turned her face slightly and stared harder at the figure outside, but he was already disappearing into the stable's shadows. Adrian worked swiftly to unhook the harness, leading the horses into the shelter of the structure beside the inn. The space was dry enough, the scent of hay sharp and comforting. He busied himself with routine, rubbing down their flanks, checking hooves, ensuring their feed. But his mind wasn't on the work. He kept glancing toward the upper window of the inn, a thin crack of light showing beneath the eaves. He imagined her standing there, not with fear or guilt, just her as she was. He finished the tasks one by one, drawing out the motions. Anything to delay, anything to give his hands something to do. But eventually, the stables fell quiet. He moved to the door and stood just beyond it, the cold rain sliding down his coat, dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked up in time to see them, Eloise and Lucien, ascending the stairs beyond the inn's front door. He watched as they disappeared beyond the threshold of a small chamber above the tavern. The light flicked, then steadied, and then the door closed. Adrian's fists clenched at his sides. He turned away from the building and walked the length of the stables. Once, then again. The rhythm of his boots on the hay-covered floor matched the rhythm in his chest. He thought of the way she had looked at him earlier. Not recognition, not quite. But there had been something there. A weight, a question. He stopped near the edge of the stable, where the boards opened slightly to the outside. Rain tapped faintly against the roof above him. From here, he could see the upper window again, open just a crack. His breath stilled. Then he heard her voice. It drifted from the window, carried by the wet air, soft, wavering. Not to Lucien. Not in the cadence of seduction or social nicety. She spoke to the silence, to the space within herself. She was remembering. She spoke of Montvignon, of the garden outside the south wing, where lavender once bloomed in late spring, of mornings spent with books and ink-stained fingers, of a marriage that had begun with hope, not politics, of him, of Adrian. Adrian stepped closer to the stable wall, heart pounding. Her voice faltered once, then resumed, quieter now. "Sometimes," she said, "I dream of him. Even now." The air around Adrian shifted. He stood utterly still, the wind dying around him. The rain slowed, and for the first time in years, he let himself believe she might still love him. The fire burned low in the small chamber, its crackling warmth barely touching the edges of the room where shadows gathered in thick corners. A narrow bed stood beneath a slanted ceiling, its blankets untouched. A single chair, worn and creaking, had been drawn close to the hearth, but neither occupant of the room sat. The storm had muted somewhat, its voice no longer a scream against the windows, but a persistent murmur of wind and distant thunder. The rain whispered down the shingles and tapped rhythmically at the narrow panes of glass. Eloise stood near the window, arms folded tightly across her chest, her back to the fire and to Lucien. Her gaze pressed into the night, though she saw little beyond the sheen of water on glass and the faint movement of trees bent beneath the wind. The light from the hearth barely reached her, and the shadows that clung to her face rendered her expression unreadable. Her shoulders were still but not relaxed. She held herself as though bracing for something unnamed, something heavy. Behind her, Lucien shifted. His footsteps were soft against the floorboards, but the impatience in his movement made them sharper than he intended. He had tried, for the first hour, to maintain his charm, his easy smile, his half-teasing voice. But her distance now stretched between them like a drawn curtain. Her silence was no longer shy. It had become something else entirely. He approached her from behind, reaching out to touch her elbow with a hand that once might have thrilled her. "You've been quiet," he said, voice low, leaning close. Too quiet for a woman escaping a gilded prison. Eloise didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she stepped away from his hand, not with force, but finality. Her arms remained folded. "I'm tired," she said. Lucien paused, his smile faltering. "You were laughing not an hour ago." "I'm not laughing now." He frowned, stepping back with a slight shake of his head. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone sharpened. "What changed, Eloise?" Her hands tightened around her upper arms. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, her breath visible on the cold glass. "Everything and nothing," she said softly. "I don't know what I expected." Outside, Adrian stood beneath the eaves of the stable, his face tilted toward the second-story window. The wind flung the rain sideways now and then, pattering across his coat, soaking the collar and sleeves. He didn't notice. His eyes were fixed upward toward the room where her silhouette stood motionless. His heart pounded beneath his ribs, not from exertion, but from the unbearable weight of proximity. She was there, just beyond reach. He could almost imagine the warmth of her skin, the sound of her breath in the quiet. It was maddening. He longed to speak, to knock, to burst in, to say the words he had swallowed for too long. But pride choked him. And more than pride, fear. What if her silence meant she had truly forgotten him? That what he saw as distance was simply indifference? He had heard her voice not long ago, drifting from that window with memories on her tongue. But memory was not love. Adrian turned away, his boots crunching over gravel and hay as he returned to the tavern door. He stepped inside briefly, the warmth of the fire downstairs greeting him only in part. The innkeeper sat behind the counter, reading from a tattered book by candlelight, unmoved by the storm. Adrian approached, his voice still altered. "Do you have space in the servant quarters?" The innkeeper looked up, disinterested. "Stable loft's open, straws dry." Adrian gave a curt nod, left a few coins on the counter, and slipped back into the night. He returned to the stable, climbed the narrow ladder to the loft, and dropped his satchel beside a worn cot stuffed with hay. He didn't lie down. Instead, he walked to the open slats in the stable wall and stood there, unmoving, as thunder began to roll again in the distance. Upstairs, Eloise still hadn't left the window. Lucien's frustration simmered quietly. He leaned on the table, hands braced on either side, eyes fixed on her back. "You're not here with me," he said finally. You left Montvignon, but you brought him with you, haven't you? Eloise's shoulders lifted once with a quiet breath. I thought I had left him behind. And now? She turned slightly, her face half illuminated by the firelight. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. Now, I don't know. Lucien crossed the room in 2 strides. His tone was urgent now, less controlled. Eloise, what are you afraid of? She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. There's something strange about the coachman. Lucien blinked. The coachman? She nodded once. Her gaze moved back to the window. He doesn't speak like a servant. He doesn't move like one. And there's something, I don't know, a feeling, a pressure, like I'm being watched by someone who knows me too well. Lucien scoffed. You're letting the storm get to you, and the wine. But her expression didn't shift. She spoke again, quieter. He reminds me of Adrien. The name settled in the room like the toll of a distant bell. Lucien stiffened, the amusement draining from his face. The candle beside them flickered as the wind groaned against the window pane. Outside, in the shadowed stable, Adrien closed his eyes. The weight of her words dropped through him like lead. She remembered. Not just the voice, or the shape, or the memory of a man she once loved, but him. He turned toward the opening in the wall, the rain now falling steadily in silver ribbons. He stood very still, breath shallow, each heartbeat drumming in his throat. In the room above, Eloise stepped back from the window, her eyes wide now with realization. Her pulse fluttered, her lips parted. She spun toward the door and reached for the bell pull. Moments later, the innkeeper trudged up the stairs, summoned by her call. He knocked once, then entered without urgency. Eloise's voice was strained but clear. The coachman, what is his name? The innkeeper scratched the back of his head, thinking. Said he was sent from Montvignon, from the Count himself. Eloise's breath caught. She stared at him, unblinking. But the Count, she whispered, wasn't supposed to know. The candle beside the hearth flared once, then guttered out. The wind had eased to a slow moan around the eaves of the inn, and the storm that had earlier pounded against the windows now murmured like an exhausted sea. The candle on the nightstand had gone out, leaving behind the faint scent of singed wick and melted wax. Only the fire remained, burning low but steady, its embers shifting like whispered secrets. Eloise stood frozen near the window, the innkeeper's words ringing in her ears long after he had gone. From Montvignon, from the Count himself. Her arms tightened around her body, but not from cold. Beneath her ribs, something sharp and fluttering had begun. Disbelief tangled with certainty. Disbelief that clung even as memory rushed to confirm it. She stared into the dark glass, her reflection shadowed and unrecognizable, her breath fogging in small, uneven clouds. She did not need to ask again. The truth settled over her not in shock, but in revelation. It had been Adrien all along, his silence, his posture. That stillness she had always known, not stiff, not mechanical, but full of things left unsaid. She had felt it when she stepped down from the carriage, when he handed her into the seat, when she dared look at him, really look. Something inside her had known before her mind was willing to speak it aloud. And now, she could not stop seeing it. She began to pace the narrow chamber, her slippers barely making a sound across the worn floorboards. Her cloak had slipped from one shoulder, the damp silk lining dragging behind her with each turn. Her pulse hadn't slowed since she'd stepped away from the window. Her body moved in measured steps, but her thoughts swirled fast and relentless. Adrien. Not just her husband in name, but the man who had once loved her with a quiet devotion she hadn't known how to return. She had believed him indifferent, cold, but it was never absence. It was a different kind of presence. He had watched her not with jealousy, not with judgment, but with reverence. She remembered the way he had once placed a hand at her back in crowded salons, not to claim her, but to steady her. The way he had looked at her when she read aloud, when she laughed, even when she was unaware. And tonight, she had felt that gaze again. Not in the inn, but long before, in the carriage, on the road. That impossible sense of being seen without being touched, known without being told. A heat that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with recognition. Lucien stirred behind her, seated now by the fire, the light warming the planes of his face. He watched her pacing with growing discomfort, his earlier amusement all but gone. "You're chasing shadows," he said at last, voice low, trying to regain her. "Whatever you think you saw, whatever you believe he is, let it go." She stopped and turned toward him, eyes dark and resolute. "I don't believe. I know." Lucien stood slowly, rubbing his palms together once, his brows drawing tight. "So what now?" he asked. "You run back to a man who shut you out for years, who didn't fight for you until you were already gone." Eloise didn't flinch. "He's here. That doesn't make him right for you. It makes him real." Lucien took a step forward, reaching for her hand. "You said yourself you wanted freedom. Something different." "I did," she whispered. "I still do. But maybe it doesn't mean what I thought." She stepped back from him, her hand falling away. Without another word, she crossed the room, lifted her cloak from the chair, and pulled it around her shoulders in one fluid motion. Her fingers were trembling, but her chin was high. She opened the door and stepped into the corridor, the hem of her gown catching on the threshold. She descended the stairs quickly, barely aware of the groan of the wood beneath her steps, or the hush of the empty tavern. The innkeeper glanced up from behind the bar, polishing glasses with the same distracted rhythm he'd had all night. "Have you seen the coachman?" she asked, breathless. The man blinked. "He went to the stables, I think. Took a cot in the loft, didn't give much notice." She didn't wait for more. The door groaned as she pushed through it and stepped out into the courtyard. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the glow of the inn's windows, broken only by scattered hay and hoofprints. The scent of wet earth, of horse, and of rain-drenched wood filled the air. Her breath rose in sharp clouds as she looked toward the stable, her heart thundering now. There, just beyond the reach of the flickering lantern, a figure stood beneath the stable overhang, upright, unmoving. He was no longer hunched, no longer cloaked in anonymity. The coat was the same, but his posture had changed. There was no hiding now. His face was shadowed, but the set of his shoulders, the line of his stance, was unmistakable. Her feet moved before she made the decision. One step, then another, until her shoes sank softly into the damp ground. Her hands were clenched beneath the folds of her cloak, her breath catching somewhere between throat and chest. She had no words, only the ache that had settled behind her ribs, growing heavier with every heartbeat. He turned slowly, as though he had known she would come. Their eyes met. And in that single moment, the years between them dissolved. There were no titles, no expectations, no walls made of silence. Only the weight of all they hadn't said, and the unbearable pull of what might still remain. She took one step closer. The stable door swung open behind them. Lucien stood there, his coat hastily pulled over his shirt, his hair still damp from the mist, eyes widening as he took in the scene before him. The air thickened so suddenly it seemed to press against the skin. Damp earth, smoke from the tavern fire, the scent of horse and pine and something more human, shame, confusion, longing. All of it swirled in the narrow space between the three of them, bound together by a tension that vibrated through the night like a taut string ready to snap. Lucien stood just beyond the stable door, his figure stiffened, wet shoulders squared. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, and usually composed, darted between Adrian and Eloise. At first they were merely puzzled, but that confusion gave way to recognition, then disbelief, and finally to something sharper, more personal. Eloise remained where she stood, Her weight shifted forward, cloak falling loose from her shoulders. Her hair was damp, curling slightly at the ends, and her face was lit by the lantern over the stable. She didn't move. Her hand hovered near her side, fingers flexing as if she wanted to reach for something but didn't know what. Adrian didn't flinch. He stood with quiet control, the storm having left its mark only in the sheen of rain across his shoulders and the line of his jaw. There was nothing apologetic in his posture, nothing confrontational either. His calm wasn't indifference. It was the stillness of a man trained to absorb everything and reveal nothing, until he must. Lucien stepped into the courtyard, boots squelching in the damp mud, his voice low but tight with disbelief. "So this is what it was," he said, glancing between them. "You've been following us? Pretending to be a coachman? All night?" Adrian's gaze remained steady. "Yes." The simplicity of the word struck harder than a denial. Lucien's jaw clenched. He exhaled once, sharply, as if forcing himself to remain dignified. "I should have known. The way you watched. The silence." His eyes flicked toward Eloise. "And you? When did you figure it out?" Eloise opened her mouth, then closed it. She looked down at the space between her feet, the hem of her gown heavy with moisture. "Just now," she murmured. "Not long before I came down." Lucien let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Of course it's him." Adrian finally spoke again, his voice even, deliberate. "I did not come to stop you." Lucien turned toward him. "Then why?" Adrian looked at Eloise, then back to Lucien. "Because I needed to see, not what she would do, but who she was with you." His voice lowered slightly, but it lost none of its control. "We've lived in silence for too long. I could no longer bear not knowing what that silence meant." Lucien stared at him, the sharp edge of his pride faltering beneath something else. Discomfort, confusion, perhaps even shame. His tone lost some of its heat. "You could have asked her. Spoken to her." "I tried," Adrian said. "For years I tried. With words, with presence, with patience. But I never asked the right question. I never listened the right way." Eloise's chest tightened. The sound of Adrian's voice speaking those words, low, calm, pained, unraveled something inside her. She watched him as if seeing him new. And yet it wasn't new. It was old, familiar, remembered in the touch of his gaze, in the way he stood beside her without reaching for her. Lucien took a breath, now visibly uneasy. He looked at Eloise again, but this time it was not with anger or possession. "And you?" he asked softly. "Was it ever really me you wanted?" Her throat moved as she swallowed, unable to speak right away. The answer was already in the air between them, already in her silence. She met his eyes, and in hers there was kindness, but no deception. "It wasn't about wanting someone," she said. "It was about not wanting to be alone anymore." Lucien nodded slowly. The sound of rain on the stable roof returned to fill the space between them. The lantern above flickered, catching the silver in the puddles around their feet. There was no yelling, no scenes, only the uncomfortable truth of misaligned needs, of illusions falling away. Lucien had offered admiration, escape, a freedom Eloise thought she needed. But now, standing between them, she saw it differently. She hadn't been running towards something. She'd been running from herself. And Adrien, despite all the quiet, despite all the years, had somehow remained a mirror she hadn't wanted to face. Lucien looked back at Adrien. "So what now?" Adrien said nothing. Lucien turned to Eloise, his tone gentled. "I won't force you to explain anything. Not to me, not to him. But you should decide." The words were simple, and for that, they struck harder than any argument might have. He didn't reach for her. He didn't plead. He stood back, offering her only the space to choose. Adrien remained quiet. Eloise looked between them. Her chest rose and fell with the effort to breathe. Her eyes flicked to Adrien, who stood not as a suitor, not as a husband demanding loyalty, but as a man stripped of everything but truth. His eyes were darker now, unshielded, weary. Yet there was something in them that hadn't been there for years. Vulnerability, willingness, a quiet, devastating hope. Her lips parted. A sound interrupted the stillness. Hoofbeats. Distant at first, then clearer. The low rumble of wheels on wet road, the groan of wood and iron, and the rhythmic cadence of approaching horses. All three turned toward the road beyond the courtyard. Lanterns flared through the fog, scattering golden light across the inn's outer walls. A second carriage approached, its silhouette elegant and angular. It pulled into the courtyard with a smooth turn, the harness bells chiming faintly. The horses stopped, and the carriage door opened with a practiced hand. Stepping down into the courtyard, her chin lifted beneath a fur-lined traveling cloak, was Comtesse Victoire d'Artois. Her gaze moved instantly between Adrien, Eloise, and Lucien, her expression hard as polished glass. Victoire d'Artois stepped into the courtyard as if she'd never left Montvignon. Her boots met the wet ground without hesitation, the hem of her fur-lined cloak lifting slightly with each step. She moved with grace honed from decades of knowing when and how to enter a room or a scandal at the precise moment of its most precarious balance. Her chin was high, her mouth a thin, uncompromising line, and her eyes, sharp beneath the brim of her traveling hood, swept the scene with the cool detachment of someone trained to absorb details faster than they could be offered. The air changed with her presence, not violently, but with an authority that couldn't be argued or denied. The Comtesse didn't speak immediately. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than the distant clap of thunder still rolling over the eastern hills. She looked first to Eloise, who stood as though anchored to the ground, hands clutching the edge of her cloak. Then to Lucien, whose posture remained tall but no longer casual. And last to Adrien, who faced his sister not as a younger brother, but as a man prepared for the confrontation he had hoped wouldn't come. Victoire exhaled through her nose, slow and measured. "So," she said at last. "It's true." No one answered. The only sound was the soft rustle of the Comtesse's cloak as she stepped closer, her expression unyielding. "I received word just after midnight," she continued, her voice clipped and controlled. "Adrien gone from Montvignon without explanation. No staff summoned, no guards, no escort, a carriage missing, Eloise absent without notice, and a guest." Her eyes passed over Lucien briefly, whose father has lately entertained thoughts far above his station. Lucien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Victoire's gaze returned to Adrien. "I came because I feared it was worse, and I see now that it nearly was." Adrien remained silent, his face unreadable. Victoire turned toward Eloise again, her voice still even but carrying steel beneath its softness. "You are the Comtesse de Montvignon. You know what that title means, what it requires. This," she gestured around the courtyard, "is ruin, waiting to be written into record." Eloise's eyes didn't fall. She didn't retreat, but her voice was quiet when she spoke. "We never meant to be found." "Then you were naive," Victoire replied. "Scandal, my dear, is always one whisper ahead of us, and you've already given it breath." Adrien stepped forward, his voice low. "Enough, Victoire." Her brows lifted. "I beg your pardon?" Adrien's words were deliberate, his control measured. "You've made your assessment. Now speak plainly." Victoire's eyes narrowed. "Very well. The masquerade at the Hôtel d'Amélie is in mere hours. Eloise's absence will already be noted. Your presence there together will be expected, and if it is not fulfilled, if Montvignon is whispered of behind masks and fans, there will be consequences. The Estates General is approaching. Nobles will soon be required to account not only for their titles, but for their behavior. Do you understand what that means?" Adrien's jaw flexed. "I understand." Victoire nodded once. "Then act like it. Return to Montvignon, Arrive in Paris on time. Present yourselves as what you were always meant to be, a united house. Any hesitation, any deviation, and you will find yourselves unwelcome not only in court, but in every hall that still respects your name." Lucien remained still, his eyes now on Eloise. He had not moved, not interrupted. But his face had changed. His usual ease was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful, more knowing. He bowed slightly, first to Victoire, then to Adrien, and then, finally, to Eloise. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly, "but I see now that it was never love." Her throat tightened. "No," she whispered, "it wasn't." He didn't linger. With the dignity he had always worn like a second coat, Lucien turned from them and walked away into the inn. He did not look back. As the first pale light of dawn touched the mist-draped trees, Victoire pulled her cloak tighter and stepped back toward her own carriage. She said nothing further. She didn't have to. Her expression said enough. She had done what she came to do, restored the structure before it collapsed. The carriage door shut behind her, and moments later, the wheels turned again, carrying her away into the thinning fog. Adrien and Eloise stood alone in the courtyard. The innkeeper emerged not long after, wheeling a small cart with the repaired wheel balanced carefully atop it. He offered a few muttered words about the fit and the weather, then disappeared again without asking questions. Adrien took the wheel and began the work in silence. His hands, though cold and sore, moved with purpose. Eloise didn't try to help. She watched him instead, her arms crossed over her chest, the ache deepening with every passing second. She remembered the way he had stood in the stable, waiting for her to speak, the way he had listened without defense, without demand. And she remembered, too, the way he had once looked at her across the altar in the cathedral, on the day they became something far more fragile than husband and wife. The way he had looked at her with reverence, yes, but also with hope. It had taken her until now to understand the difference. When the carriage was ready again, Adrien led the horses back into harness. The leather creaked beneath his touch. Rain still lingered in the sky, though now it was no more than a mist. The morning had begun to break, casting the landscape in a delicate gold that barely warmed the chill. He opened the carriage door without a word. Eloise stepped inside. She did not look behind her. Adrien climbed the driver's box once more. The reins pulled taut. The wheels turned. They passed through the courtyard slowly, the mud clinging to the tires, the ruts from the earlier storm still deep and wet. No one spoke. The clatter of hooves echoed softly in the mist. As they passed the outer edge of the forest, the sun finally breached the horizon, and the road ahead gleamed with gold. Light shimmered on the wet leaves, and the shadows receded, drawn back like curtains before a stage. Still, neither spoke. And then, just as the trees began to close in again and the first bend swallowed them back into the woods, the sky opened with a sudden downpour, heavy and cold, drumming against the carriage roof in a steady, unrelenting rhythm. The carriage rolled through the rain-soaked landscape, its wheels cutting quiet grooves into the soft earth of the road. Morning had come, though it wore no warmth. A heavy mist blanketed the fields, swallowing fences and distant trees, until all that remained was a world of blurred edges and dim gold light. The rain had lost its fury, falling now in a steady drizzle that painted the glass with thin rivulets, making the horizon shimmer and sway. Inside the carriage, Eloise leaned against the window, her cheek resting against the cool pane. Her breath fogged the glass in slow exhalations, fading almost as quickly as they formed. Outside, the countryside passed in silence. Sodden meadows, gnarled hedgerows, branches bent beneath the weight of water, but her eyes barely followed it. Her reflection blinked back at her, blurred, soft-edged, unfamiliar. She stared not at the rain, but into the hollow behind it, into the path that had brought her here. She thought of the carriage's first departure, only the night before when she had climbed in believing she was leaving something behind. The disguise, the stillness of the coachman, his silence. At first it had seemed like punishment, a refusal to speak the truth aloud. But now she understood it for what it was, not a weapon, a mirror. The moment in the courtyard echoed loudest, the moment when Adrian had stood before her without accusation, when he had let her choose and said nothing to sway her. It had been that silence, not any confession, that had broken something inside her. She no longer saw the Count of Montvignon as a distant figure behind a title, behind expectation. She saw Adrian now as he was, the man who listened, even in pain, who watched not to catch, but to understand. The man who had allowed her to speak without interruption, and who had stepped into shadow not to disappear, but to let her see him clearly. And now, impossibly, that clarity remained. Her heart still ached with questions, but the panic had ebbed. Her mind no longer raced to defend, to justify. There was a quiet here, strange and unfamiliar, the kind that comes not from resolution, but from surrender. She had stopped running, and for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. Outside, on the driver's box, Adrian kept the reins loose in his hands. The horses trotted at a steady pace, unhurried and obedient, their flanks dark with moisture, their breath ghosting into the morning air. The road beneath them was uneven in parts, washed in places by shallow rivulets of runoff, but he guided them with practiced care. His coat was soaked through, the collar limp against his neck. Rain trailed down his face, gathered at his jaw, but he didn't move to wipe it away. His eyes remained on the road, but his mind wandered elsewhere, circling the carriage's interior, resting where she sat. He had not spoken since they'd departed the inn. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't yet know what belonged to words and what needed time. After so much silence, he no longer trusted the first thing he might utter. But something had changed. He could feel it behind him, not in her posture or the sound of her breathing, but in the quiet itself. It no longer pressed like a wall between them. It felt like waiting, like breath held. As they reached the fork in the road, he slowed the horses. The direct path to Montvignon veered to the right, flatter, faster, but to the left stretched a narrow lane, flanked by wild hedges and dormant orchards, lined with dark, crooked trees, whose blossoms had long since fallen. It was longer, slower, and familiar. He hesitated for only a second, then turned the reins. The horses followed, the carriage wheels slipping slightly as they curved onto the forgotten path. It had been years since they'd taken this road. He remembered it in pieces, the smell of crushed apple blossoms, the sound of her laughter over the rattle of the wheels. They had traveled it together once, on the morning after their wedding, when the world had felt new and promises had not yet begun to fade. He didn't glance behind him. He didn't explain. But inside, Eloise lifted her head from the window. She recognized the turn instantly. Her eyes flicked to the orchard trees, to the way the mist clung to their bare limbs. She had not thought of that morning in a long time, not since they had stopped speaking of things that mattered. And yet, here it was again, quietly offered. A memory not spoken of, but returned to. Her hand rested in her lap, still and open. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The carriage moved slowly through the orchard valley. The trees gave way to rolling hills, then flattened again as Montvignon came into view, its silhouette rising through the mist, softened by distance and sleep. No lights glowed from its windows yet. No servants stirred in the courtyard. It looked almost like a dream, standing still against the pale sky, untouched by the turmoil of the night before. The horses slowed to a halt near the front steps. Adrian climbed down in silence, his boots landing with a soft splash in the gravel. He moved to the carriage door and opened it, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Eloise met his eyes. They lingered there, not for explanation, not for apology, but for something deeper. She stepped down slowly, her hand brushing the edge of the doorway, and the moment her feet touched the ground, the space between them shifted. She didn't speak. She turned toward the manor steps, walking slowly, her cloak trailing behind her in the damp morning light. Adrien followed, a pace behind. The great doors of Montvignon creaked open, summoned by the early staff without word. The butler bowed, blinking at the unexpected return, but asked no questions. They stepped into the entrance hall, marble beneath their feet, the scent of wax and dried herbs in the air. The fire in the hearth had not yet been lit. As they crossed the threshold, the mask of propriety settled over them once more. Their expressions schooled, their shoulders straight. But something beneath it had shifted, so slightly it could not be named. They were no longer strangers passing in corridors. Something had broken, and something else had begun to mend. Later, as the grey morning deepened into muted afternoon, the household stirred to its usual rhythm. Silver was polished. Fires were lit. Drapes were drawn open to let in what light there was. By evening, the chandeliers glowed. The drawing room was prepared, the servants quiet and efficient. But Adrien was not in the drawing room. He found her instead in the music chamber, where the windows looked out over the eastern lawn and the first stars waited behind the thinning clouds. Eloise sat at the harpsichord, its lacquered surface dulled slightly with age. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not pressing, only tracing the memory of sound. She did not play. She only sat, head tilted, as if listening to something from long ago. Adrien paused in the doorway. He watched her in silence, the lamplight soft on her hair, the air between them thick with everything unsaid. She rested her hand on middle C, her thumb pressed gently, once, and from somewhere in the house, a door creaked open. The first frost arrived quietly, veiling Montvignon's gardens in a delicate shimmer, as if the estate itself had chosen silence to match its occupants. The days grew shorter, the air more brittle, and the world outside the great windows seemed held in a breathless pause between seasons. Within the walls of the manor, life resumed, but not as it had before. Not quite. The hush that lingered between Adrien and Eloise no longer bruised. It softened. It filled not with bitterness or regret, but with something fragile and unfamiliar, possibility. The silence did not press now. It waited. It listened. And slowly, without ceremony, they began to fill it. There were no declarations, no apologies asked or offered, only gestures. One morning, Eloise stepped into the gardens, her cloak wrapped tightly about her, and found Adrien already there, gloved hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the frozen hedge maze. She said nothing, but her steps slowed beside him, and he adjusted his pace to match hers. The frost crunched beneath their boots. She asked, after a time, whether the orchard trees would bloom late again in spring, and he nodded once, eyes still forward. That was all. It was enough. In the evenings, she began requesting supper served in the smaller dining room, the one they had abandoned during the colder years of silence. The servants took note, discreet and careful, reviving a table once set for laughter, and now laid with quiet intention. Adrien joined her without prompting. Their conversations were sparse at first, lingering on weather, estate matters, books she'd once read. But slowly, subtly, the words deepened. He asked what music she had been studying at the harpsichord. She inquired about the vineyard's yield, neither mentioned Paris, or Lucienne, or the inn whose walls still echoed in memory. But those echoes lived in every glance exchanged between courses, in every brush of his hand against hers as he passed a dish, in the shared silences that were no longer barriers but bridges. Their rhythm returned, but slower now, softer, as though they had been forced to relearn one another's steps and were not in a hurry to perfect the dance. One evening, near twilight, Adrien retreated to the library. The fire had been lit already, crackling softly in the hearth. The shelves, high and heavy with dust-laced spines, had always been a place of refuge, but tonight he wandered them differently. Less to escape, more to remember. His fingers skimmed across the row of volumes Eloise used to favor, novels in French and Italian, the occasional collection of poetry. It had been years since he'd seen her take one from the shelf. He reached for a slim blue-bound book, its spine worn, and opened it near the middle. There, nestled between the pages, was a folded sheet of cream paper. He paused, the edges softened by handling, the ink a muted brown where water had touched it once. It was not sealed. He opened it slowly, uncertain of what it might hold. There was no signature, no name at the top or bottom, but it was unmistakably hers. The loops of the letters, the careful spacing. He recognized the curve of every word. She had not written a confession. She had written remembrance. She spoke of a younger self, of a woman who had once stood beside him at the altar and believed in love not because it was expected, but because she had felt it, fiercely, all-consuming. She had written of the man she had married, not the count, not the heir, not the dutiful husband, but Adrian, the one who had stayed up with her on stormy nights, who had once kissed her wrist beneath the olive tree in the southern garden and whispered that he would always choose her. She wrote that she feared that man had disappeared, that duty had swallowed him, that silence had replaced the sound of his laughter. But in the carriage, she had seen him again, not in words, but in presence, in the way he had watched without judgment, in the way he had heard her without ever interrupting. She wrote, "In your silence, I finally heard you. And I think, no, I know, I never stopped listening." Adrian folded the letter slowly, reverently, and held it in his palm for a long while. The firelight flickered over his face, catching in his eyes. Something lifted inside him, a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He placed the letter back between the pages and returned the book to the shelf. That night, the manor was bathed in lamplight. Soft golden hues glowed against the walls, and the scent of beeswax and kindling drifted through the corridors. A faint melody floated down one of the longer halls. Not loud, not flawless, just a simple, slow string of notes. Adrien followed it. The music chamber door stood ajar, the hinges silent. Inside, the room glowed with the light of 3 low-burning candles. The harpsichord waited near the windows, its lid propped open. And seated before it, her back straight, her posture familiar, was Eloise. Her fingers touched the keys gently, coaxing sound without insistence. The melody was half-formed, as if remembered rather than read. It rose and fell with delicate imprecision, pauses scattered like breath. She didn't notice him at first, or if she did, she made no sign. He stood in the doorway, watching. She played a little more, no song in particular, only feeling. Her left hand faltered, and the notes drifted into silence. But she didn't lift her hands. She remained there, fingertips hovering. Adrien stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked faintly beneath his weight. She did not turn. He crossed the room slowly, his boots whispering across the carpet runner. As he neared the instrument, he placed one hand gently on the edge of the harpsichord, his fingers resting just inches from hers. Still, she didn't play. She only sat, listening to the space between them. And then she turned her head, slowly, her profile catching the candlelight. Their eyes met. No tension, no doubt. Her mouth curved faintly, not a full smile, but a beginning. Adrian's breath caught, and he stepped closer. The wind shifted outside, brushing the window panes. And in the flickering glow of the candles, they remained, still, close, both waiting not for permission, but for the moment to choose. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of this story? Was there a moment that stayed with you? A glance, a word, a choice? I'd love to know which part touched you most. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. I truly enjoy reading what you have to say, and your feedback means the world. Your comment also helps others discover the story, so thank you for being part of this journey. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.